Welcome to The Spiritual Life. I'm Father Jim Martin. On this podcast, we reflect on how people experience God in their prayer and in their daily lives. And I'm joined by my excellent producer, Maggie Van Dorn. Maggie, good to be with you.
Oh, it's so good to be here, Jim. And we have quite the guest ahead of us.
We do. I'm really excited. We're speaking with Julia Osęka.
Yeah, Julia Osęka made history as the youngest woman present as a voting member at the Synod on Synodality in 2023 and 2024. So this was a worldwide gathering of Catholics at the Vatican. It was called by Pope Francis, and it was designed to bring bishops and lay people together to listen and discern where the Holy Spirit is working. It also marked the first time a synod included delegates who were not bishops. At the time, Julia was a junior in college studying theology and physics at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Julia had been leading students in local listening sessions, and it was out of this coalition that she was selected by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia to attend the Synod in Rome as a voting delegate. And that is where you came in, right, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it was obvious when you walked in that she was among the youngest people in the room. As we say in this conversation, there was another fellow named Wyatt from Wyoming, another young priest from the United States, Father Yvonne, but she's remarkable. And then I found out, oh my gosh, you go to St. Joseph's University. I'm from Philadelphia, so that was a big bonding thing. And I noticed you, and our listeners will notice she has a bit of an accent. She's from Poland and speaks flawless English. So that was also, just a source of kind of wonder and fascination. So I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah. But first, let's hear a question from our audience. This one comes from Jerry. And Jerry asks, how can I better focus and find myself in the presence of God during the examen?
Well, thanks, Jerry. First, for those who aren't familiar with it, the examen or the examination of conscience is a short prayer that you say at the end of the day, popularized by St. Ignatius, not invented by him. And it has a few steps. You start by placing yourself in the presence of God. You call to mind things you're grateful for. You review the day. You look at places where you might be sorry for your sins. And then you ask for the grace to experience God in the next day. So it's usually at the end of the day, maybe about 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes. So the question of how can I better focus and find myself in the presence of God, I would say two things. First of all, remember that it's not a monologue, right? That it is a dialogue, that you're with God, right? You ask for God's presence at the very beginning. And sometimes we can just sort of run through it as if it's a list. And then I did this, and then I did that. And you tend to kind of get wrapped up in your own mind. So the first thing is to remember that it is a conversation. But I think there are a couple ways where you can actually call to mind that you're in God's presence. And one of the ways is to actually say to yourself, God, please, make me be aware of your presence. I mean, explicitly say that in the prayer to remind yourself, rather than just kind of plopping yourself down and, kind of going through the day. But I think one of the most effective ways, which I use and which St. Ignatius recommends in the spiritual exercises, is this. And it's kind of unusual. It is to think about where you're going to be praying, sitting or lying down, yes. Standing a little bit apart from that and looking at that spot, usually a chair, and imagine God looking at you. So just a few seconds, imagine God actually looking at you in that space. And then once you sit in that space or kneel in that space or lie in that space, it really does kind of change the dynamic because you really have taken some time to place yourself in the presence of God. Which we're always in, but it's about being conscious of that. And then to, remind yourself in a physical way that God is with you. So I find those methods pretty helpful.
Oh, I love that. I love this approach of imagining God watching you, like see God or behold God, beholding you, smiling, right? That's, who is that from?
Anthony DeMello, yeah.
Thank you.
Which
yes.
I love. Look at God looking at you and smiling.
Yeah,
so,
somehow like shifting that perspective does enable you to enter the scene of your life in prayer in a different way.
Totally. And wonderfully, Julia will answer that question. She talks a good deal about the examination of conscience in our conversation.
And if any of you would like to ask Father Jim a question, you can write to us at thespirituallife@americamedia.org.
And now a word from our sponsor. Looking for a simple way to deepen your own spiritual life? Give Us This Day is a superb resource that helps Catholics stay rooted in Scripture and in prayer, wherever you are, no matter how busy you are. It features reliable and relatable spiritual reflections, essays on the lives of the saints, and of course, prayers to accompany you throughout the day. I'm honored to be an editorial advisor, and I've been writing a monthly essay since the very beginning called Teach Us to Pray. But I also use it. I'm a user of Give Us This Day as well as a contributor. I use it every single day. And here's a great offer right now. Listeners of The Spiritual Life can get 10% off their new print subscription. Just visit giveusthisday.org/spiritual life and join our community of Catholics praying together. Again, that's giveusthisday.org/spiritual life. And now, on to our conversation with my friend and fellow Synod delegate, Julia Osęka. So, Julia, welcome to The Spiritual Life.
Hello, it's great to be here with you.
I'm so happy to see you. It was always great to see you at the Synod. You always made me smile. So it's nice to have you back. We're going to start right in. You were born in Poland and you're actually zooming in from your hometown. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing there and how that influenced your spirituality?
Absolutely. So as you may know, and maybe some listeners may be familiar too, Poland is a primarily Catholic country, and obviously with John Paul II being a Polish Pope, the first one and the first non-Italian after a long, long time, that was before I was born, which was in 2001. Our country has seen really like a big boom with Polish Catholicism as a whole. So I grew up with a lot of religious practices very deeply rooted into our culture. As Poles and living in the countryside as well, you know, there are some special countryside practices like the May Litany by this roadside crosses. That was a really, really big deal. My family was Catholic, still is largely. So we would go to church every Sunday for the 9:30 a.m. Mass. When I was old enough, I joined the children's choir at our local parish. The communion prep and the sacramental prep was a part of my public school, which also says a lot. And that was my childhood, really. So we would kneel down with my dad and my mom and my brother every night to say Paciorek, which is like a set of little prayers. You know, you said Hail Mary, Our Father, the Creed, a prayer to the guardian angels, and that was our nightly ritual. We would go to bed after that. But looking at it from now, I think those practices, having been so deeply rooted into like a family life, cultural life, have almost been for me like a checklist, things that I have to do in order to be a Catholic, in order to be a good Polish Catholic girl. But there wasn't really any substance to it, any meat. It was very hard for me once I realized, you know, that prayer or being a religious person has something to do with relationships. That was a big discovery for me. And I was about 13 when that really hit me, that reciting prayers really isn't cutting it for me. And I think there is something deeper in it.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you two follow-up questions. Can you describe that May Litany? I'm curious what that was and what that looked like.
Oh, absolutely. So you're probably familiar with the Loreto Litany, the Litany to Our Lady, which in Polish we call it Litania Loretańska, so the Loreto Litany. And it is traditionally recited every single day of the month of May, which is traditionally devoted to Our Lady. And in the countryside specifically, we have those big crosses or kapliczki. Sometimes that's more than a cross. So that's a little building with a cross on top of it, or just a big wooden cross with like ribbons and flowers around it. And those were traditionally places for prayer for people who are journeying or maybe traveling from one village to another. You would stop by and offer your journey or whatever business you're on to God. So traditionally, the grandmas or the women from the village would gather out those local roadside crosses or kapliczki to together recite the litany to Our Lady and then sing some Marian songs and hymns that are also traditionally within like the Polish prayer hymnal.
That sounds beautiful. Now, the second question is kind of related to that. So you really interesting comment. You said you felt that some of these things didn't have as much substance as you wanted. So am I right in saying that you felt like this was more kind of like a checklist of things to do? Is that what you were saying when you said it didn't have substance?
Yeah, I think a checklist is a perfect word for it. Although I also don't want to take away from people who still practice those traditions to that extent. But what I was missing, that substance that I was missing, was a development of a relationship building through that prayer life, through those religious practices. Having the example of the May litany gatherings, right? So the ladies would gather, and I would do it with my grandma for quite a while, right? The ladies would gather at the cross. Hi, how are you doing? How's your husband? How's your dog doing? What's up? Then, okay, let's start. And we are starting with the hymns, then we are reciting the litany, then we are doing the hymns again. And then we say, okay, see you tomorrow, bye-bye. And there was no space for like, oh, did it touch anything in me? Was I inspired in any way? I'm going through something. It was really like a chitty chatter situation, a little bit of a town gossip. Then we recite the prayer, and then we go home to cook dinner.
I think you brought up a good point, which is not to, and I don't hear you doing this, denigrating those practices, because they bring a lot of comfort to people. And I mean, I just said the rosary this morning. There's lots of things that are traditional, popular piety that bring people a lot of comfort. But the insight was that you wanted to go even deeper. I was curious, so you wanted your religion to be more relational. And am I hearing you right in saying that the relationships you were looking for was with other people, or are you also talking about like a deeper relationship with God? What did you mean by more relational?
Yeah, I think both. Obviously, the aspect of building relationships with other people was present to a certain extent, although that didn't really have a spiritual dimension to it, right? We would just talk about our life, school, the town, whatever. God, the concept of God, was completely abstract to me for the first 13 years of my life, right? And I remember particularly preparing for my first Holy Communion, and learning and trying to comprehend that I will receive God and God will come into my heart with God's body and blood. And I was really trying hard, like physically trying hard to understand what it really means. How will that change who I am? That completely abstract person will come into my life in a substantial form, in a substance of a bread. But I don't know who the person is. I know all those prayers and I know the theoretical stuff, the creed, the basic concepts of our Catholic faith, but I don't know that guy, in that sense. So that was something that I didn't know I was seeking. But once I met people who told me that you can have a relationship with God, I was just starstruck. It was a life-changing experience for me to realize that and to start pursuing that too.
Well, here's the obvious next question. So how did you pursue it, and what did you find? Because I think for a lot of our listeners, that's a really important move, right? To go from the sort of belief, right, into this, what we talk about on this podcast all the time, that's kind of personal relationship show. So I'm really curious about the pursuit and what you found.
So obviously, I would imagine that happens in different ways for many people because we are all different and beautiful creations. For me, it happened when I was 13, and I wanted to be like the older kids from my parish who were going to those retreats over the summer. But those were for 16 and plus. I was a little too small for that. I just merely finished my primary school, but I was bothering our parish priest who was teaching me religion at my primary school that I really, really want to go to because they learn cool songs and whatnot. So he connected me with the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth because he knew that they also offer a retreat for younger kids, 13 and up. So it was there. I went there and I met those people who were about my age, so middle school-ish people, and they were, oh, God is a person, you can be friends with God, you can have a relationship with God. And I'm a very talkative person. I was quiet for the entire week of the retreat because I was trying to take it in and see and experience how those people live their faith life and see how they pray during Eucharistic adoration, that there's quiet time. I'm trying to think, what do they do? Do they just stare at the host, or do they recite some prayers in their heads? And some people were really like emotionally moved too. So that was something new for me. Also, meeting religious sisters was quite an important step on that way of discovery of my spiritual life, because it was mind-blowing for me that someone can be so into faith so that they choose to give their entire life to it, and not have a family, not have a husband, not have children, live in those communities with other nuns. And it was a beautiful thing, but very hard to comprehend. But as I was saying, this time overlapping with my middle school experience, I think that was a time of a little rebellious Julia coming out. Not rebellious in like a, opposing my parents or whatever, but questioning a lot of things. I had a lot of questions. And I think that giving myself the freedom to let go of some of those presuppositions, of letting go of the notion that I will only be a good Catholic if I recite the Pachorek every night, and maybe trying to look for other rituals or other practices that I didn't know about before. I tried Lectio Divina because that's what the sisters were doing with some girls at my school, and I didn't really like it that much. But I figured out that the sisters are praying the breviary every single day, and I found it very interesting. So I started praying the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer, the Vespers as well, irregularly, not every day. But I found that to be quite life-changing, because I was exposing myself to the scriptures, and they were kind of, in a flow every day, and they were guiding the way I was looking at my day. There was a little note about the patron saint of the day, so I would read a little bit about the patron saint and think, wow, today's the day I could think about that and how that influences my life. But it wasn't a structured prayer. I wasn't doing it with a community, it was just kind of me trying to figure out what vibes with me and what touches me on that deeper level, not merely as a satisfaction of something I have to do, but something that inspires me and maybe consoles me or opens up my spiritual horizons.
So is it at this point that you started to feel what you might call a personal relationship with God? Was there one moment that you remember that you felt, oh my gosh, now I do know God as a person, as you were looking up to the older kids who had that experience?
I don't think there was one particular moment. I still, we're 11 years later, I'm 24 right now, and I'm glad to say that I don't know God. God is someone who keeps revealing themselves to me still in new context and in new ways and through people and nature and situations I find myself in. But I think starting from that point, meeting people who claimed to have a relationship with God, I became aware of the fact that that is something one can pursue. And I felt invited to pursue that too.
Well, that's a very honest answer, because, I think it was Aquinas who said if we could define God, it's not God, right? And if we can say, I know God, God's always more. And even in the Gospels, in John's Gospel, I was reading recently, some New Testament commentator said the people who say, I know, in John's Gospel, are ones that don't know, so it's always that Jesus is kind of always more. But I guess my question is, you don't know God fully, but you've had experiences of God, and God's kind of revealed God's self to you. So how does that happen for you? And what are the ways that God over your life, has been revealed to you?
Well, having had my Jesuit education, I think I can use the language of consolation and desolation, which I think those two words are very helpful in defining those moments. So the moments of consolation are when I feel at peace internally, even though maybe external circumstances are not very peaceful, right? but that is a moment, a state in which I feel God's presence, not, magically behind me, tapping my arm, but I know that there is a higher love and higher justice and higher truth that I can refer to. And that higher love is a person who also loves me.
Well, and thanks for saying that it's not like, there's someone literally tapping you on the shoulder, because I think so many people, they feel like they have to have some, almost mystical experience. But what you're saying is, it's just kind of reflecting on what's happening in the day and where you feel those moments of consolation. I think that's a really important part of the spiritual life, that people understand that it doesn't have to be these, as you say, magical moments. It could be very simple moments that God has of, kind of communicating with us. Let me shift the conversation a little bit. You were the youngest woman at the Synod of Bishops, which was pretty extraordinary. And I think, by my count, the youngest member after our friend Wyatt. Is that correct?
I think it is, yes.
So we've talked about the Synod on this podcast before. It was a multi-year gathering of Catholic leaders to make the church more listening, more welcoming, more inclusive. And we had 2 sessions in person at the Vatican, which both Julia and I participated in, one in October 2023 and one in October 2024. And, I was delighted to meet you, and just equally delighted that you and Wyatt were so young. I'm sure everybody asks you this question. How did you come to be selected for the Synod?
By God's will, I hope.
Absolutely. And how did God's will play out in your life? How did that work?
Well, I was inspired by the greatest woman at the Vatican I know of, Sister Natalie Vicard, who I listened to her being interviewed at a podcast, and her way of explaining what the Synod is, and that was before, I think it was right after like the first stage of the Synod, so the local consultations have started. Her way of describing what it is was just so human and so real and so inviting. I felt like that might be a space where I might feel comfortable, and there might be something good coming out of that if this is the person who's the undersecretary, you know what I mean? At the time I was studying at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
And our campus ministers announced that there will be listening sessions on our campuses. They established this synodal collective called SHEEP, which stands for Synodality in Catholic Higher Education in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And it gathered all Catholic universities and colleges, and also Newman centers from the Philly area. So we had our listening sessions on campuses, and then we had cross-campus listening sessions, and we invited Archbishop Perez of Philadelphia, who was a great guy to have during those gatherings. He really sat and listened to us. And I think he was so moved from, the numbers, all the young people who turned up to those gatherings and the vulnerability that was really present during those listening sessions, that he decided to have a young person representative from Philly colleges and universities to the continental stage of the Synod, where each archdiocese or eparchy or larger congregations would also send delegates from those groups or those communities to, again, discern and have those conversations on a North American level. And I ended up being the person to represent the young people from Philadelphia. How? I don't know. It was the Archbishop's choice, I believe. But that happened. And then we had the continental stage was fully online. So we had Zoom sessions, and I believe there was 12 of them. So after those 12 sessions, we had a debrief session with representatives from all those 12 sessions. I know it's very complicated. And I ended up being the representative from my session to the smaller group debrief session. And then obviously our late Pope Francis made this humongous change to how the Synod is to be conducted, with including the non-bishop members and non-bishop delegates from the continental regions. And I just got an email from the USCCB asking if I would potentially be free during October of 2023 for the session. And I said yes. And then I received another email saying, okay, so you better be.
Amazing. One of the questions I wanted to ask you for this podcast for a long time was, so what was that experience like for you? I know we've talked a lot about it, but I mean, here you are, you're a college undergraduate, you're walking into the Paul VI Aula, which is the big room at the Vatican with 350 delegates, including the Pope was there most days, multiple cardinals and archbishops and bishops and lay leaders. And I mean, even I was sort of overwhelmed. What was it like for you? What was the initial experience like, and how did it kind of continue throughout the synod?
The very initial experience, I think that the moment that's really etched into my head is you probably remember it, the opening dinner that was sponsored by the the Italian Conference of Catholic Bishops. It was right after the Mass and before we departed for the opening retreat. And I was shaking. I was so scared and overwhelmed. It felt surreal. I've never seen this many bishops in my life in one place,
Me neither.
Right. So that was honestly a stressful and quite a scary experience. I obviously kept in mind that it will evolve and I will eventually meet some of them and hopefully we'll have some good conversations. And I'm not here to fight anyone, obviously. But I was quite afraid. And I remember looking for Wyatt and Ivan, whom I met before. And we just kind of found our little table and stayed there and bunkered up and just didn't move and didn't talk to anyone because all of us were, I think, we were just looking around and being like, oh, I read an article about this guy, like, oh my goodness, this is Arturo Sosa,
No, so Wyatt's the other young fellow from Wyoming, and Father Ivan is also a young priest, so I can see all of you kind of banding together. When did you start to feel comfortable, or did you start to feel comfortable at some point? And what helped you in that situation?
Well, I felt encouraged during the retreat when Father Timothy Ratcliffe was giving us his meditations, which were absolutely incredible. And I think, I've been through the synodal processes for the past 2 years at that point, and I attended many listening sessions, and I knew what the synod was about, and I read all the documents. I felt mentally prepared, but I don't think I was spiritually prepared for the actual session of the synod, which we're about to start. But his comment about identities in friendships was something that really, really touched me, because what he said, and I hope I don't misquote him, it's just a paraphrase, right? That if there is anything you should be trying to do at the synod is to make friends. And then he said, but remember, our identities change in friendships. When we enter into a relationship that's vulnerable and open and sincere, our identities are subject to change. And I thought, wow, because I think we tend to think about identities in today's society as something that's untouchable, that's mine, and nobody can, you cannot define me, you cannot change my identity. And there he was claiming that, yes, and that's how relationships should work, that I should change even to the extent of my identity. And I felt vulnerable at that point because I thought to myself, am I free to give that up? Am I open enough? Am I sincere enough so that I can not only try to befriend maybe a bishop who I know is, on a different page when it comes to certain things than I am. So not only to befriend that guy, but to also let him change me. That I really saw the guards that were up. It was a very real moment for me. So I was coming into the assembly with this presupposition, this thought of, we are all trying to make the best out of it. We are all here to sanctify our church, to make it a better, more loving, safer space for all of us. And I think that gave me a lot of the feeling of safety, of being welcomed into that space.
How about hard moments? Were there hard moments for you or challenges for you during the synod?
Oh, yes. I think, many. The synod was a big challenge for me, both personally, emotionally, there were moments when I felt, it's hard to even talk about it because on one hand, I am aware of the fact that all of us who gathered there came from so many different cultural contexts and ecclesial contexts too. But there were moments during the personal interventions, especially, when I felt that the way some people are talking about other people is really dehumanizing and is lacking Christian charity. And that really, really hurt me. And I felt like, you guys are the leaders of the local churches and you speak of other people like that? That's really sad. And I believe that even motivated one of my interventions where I addressed that topic. Also, seeing how the institutional church is so hard to respond to mold its gears, almost its way of functioning to the sensus fidei, to the discernment that was going on, to the spirit that was present in the hall and in our conversations and in our prayers, and how we were using safe language or language that was maybe omitting some harder issues or topics or the ones that maybe we didn't fully agree, but we didn't even acknowledge their presence. Those were moments when I really felt deflated. And someone told me, someone who was present at the synod too, Julia, you never ask how the sausage is made. And I was played in the sausage factory for 2 months. That was difficult.
Yeah, it was. I found that hard too. And, the personal interventions that Julia is talking about were opportunities where you could not only speak to your table. I'm sure people have seen images of the tables that we were around, 12 people per table, but you could make an intervention to the whole group, to the plenary session, and you would see these people on your sort of laptop screens. And I was surprised as well, some of the language that was used, particularly around like LGBTQ people, and it was dehumanizing. And it was really something, I mean, we're all smart people. I think we all realize that, different parts of the world have different ways of looking at things. But boy, when you hear it in person, and when you hear a church leader, almost angry without breaking any confidences, saying these kinds of things, it was really sobering. And then to hear it, kind of face to face. So I know that people are going to want to know the answer to this question. So how did you deal with that? What enabled you to move through that? And where was God in all this? That's a lot of questions to ask about that topic. But I think, people who might be frustrated with some parts of the institutional church would be interested in your answer.
Mm-hmm.
As would I.
Well, I still am frustrated and I still struggle with it. That is still very much affecting me on so many levels. But I think that what sustained me and what made me not lose hope and what made me stay a Catholic and what made me want to pursue theology, further, were people. And I also think that God was really present in the relationships we developed at the Synod. So it's just a thought that popped into my head right now. What Father Ratcliffe said at the beginning, that your primary goal for the first session of the Synod is to make friends. He was giving us like a, whatchamacallit? It's
a life preserver.
Life preserver.
Yeah, life preserver. Yeah, I think you're right that enabled us to continue, and even in the face of frustrations. But I'll just say, I saw someone every day. I saw you every single day. I think we talked every day. I saw someone who, even in the midst of the frustrations, right, was still committed, right? Committed to synodality. I mean, committed to sharing and being with people and listening. And so I didn't see someone who shut down, right? So I found that very edifying. Let me ask you something, which I always wanted to ask you. I always felt a little sorry for you because I felt that every time you came on the screen, people thought, oh, the young person. Now we're going to hear from the young person. What do young people think? Was there ever a feeling that you and Wyatt and Yvonne felt kind of burden almost that all these people would say, oh, now we get to hear what every young person in the world thinks? Or did you feel free of that and just kind of spoke your piece? What do you think about that?
That's an incredible question. I certainly think that more representation would be nicer, right?
Yeah.
Right, that's for sure. Being the only 20-something-year-old woman at the Synod was speaking volumes.
Mm-hmm.
But, the first thing I'm going to say is that Wyatt and Yvonne and I, although we are best friends and we are doing things together and we are still keeping in touch, we're very different people. So I think what we were saying was painting a diverse, although those were three voices, right? So how diverse can it get? But nevertheless, a diverse picture of the church or the perception of the church from the perspective of a young person. So that was good. Another thing was the question you asked was, did I feel burdened with that tokenization? No, I think if someone really saw my face and thought, oh, this is what all young people think, I'm sorry, that's not my problem.
Right.
You're the bishop or, you're the local pastor. You should know your people better than to think that I am the representation of all of them.
No, that's a good point. So you're among all these leaders and lay leaders and cardinals and clerics and the Pope. Was there something that you think that was misunderstood about young Catholics that you came into contact with frequently? I mean, not in a negative way, but just something that people didn't understand about Catholic youth that you came into contact with?
Well, I've heard many comments that were completely off base, but I don't think any of them were, the majority or like a common voice. Well, actually, at one of my tables, I've heard from one of the bishops from one of my tables after the conversations in the spirit, and he said, Julia, when I first saw that you were at our table and I heard you speak, I thought, she's so young. She doesn't know anything about what's going on here, and she doesn't know what the church is like, and what does she know about the global church and the struggle. She just comes from her little bubble of young people trying to rebel. But then I realized that that's an important voice too. And I think that was a very honest reaction, which acknowledged what is true, which is the fact that I don't have the experience of a 70-year-old bishop. And I was, 22 at the time, obviously. But at the same time, the fact that I don't have the same volume of experience doesn't invalidate my experience. And my experience is different from what that particular bishop or anyone who is older than me might have had when they were 22. We live in different times. So to listen to all truly means to listen to all, also generation-wise. And I really appreciated that comment.
No, that's it's funny you should say that, because I had that similar conversation with a lot of people. And I think that's a very synodal conversation. Like, I don't quite understand you, and I didn't quite get you when I first met you, but now I can listen to you. You're a friend. And I thought that was part of the transformational power of the synod. And I often say to people, when you do these synodal conversations, whether it's in a parish or in your diocese, you'll find this. You will, if you really stick to it, it works. Now, to bring our conversation to a little bit of a close, looking ahead, I know without sharing what you've shared with me, there's a little bit of a shift in your planned career, and you're about to study theology. Can you talk about that decision and kind of what questions you bring into this next chapter of your life?
Absolutely. Well, so I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in May, with a Bachelor of Science in Physics, and theology was my secondary major. The Synod was really an experience that made me realize that there is a space for me in theology, not only in academia, but also in the Catholic Church. And there is a need for more representation. And I'm not talking about tokenizing representation again, right? Like, oh, me being a woman is hyping up but there are many amazing female theologians out there. So what really encouraged me to pursue theology was that thought of being the change maker. and creating those spaces of thought, of discernment, of analysis, of free thinking, and making theology more diverse through bringing more diverse voices into the conversation, which is not the case. Theology is unfortunately a pretty hermeneutic space, the academic theology at least. And that's what I want to study, and I hope to research ecclesiology more broadly. I hope to work with some bright minds, and eventually, fingers crossed, I hope to lead those conversations in the classroom with young people who may find themselves in a similar position to a lot of young people those days, and me included. What do I do? What is faith? What is spiritual life? I don't like the church. I don't like my parish. Can I still have a relationship with God? Will I go to heaven? Yeah.
Well, I think that's great. And I know you already are a great asset to the church. By the way, for our listeners, ecclesiology is really the study of the church. And we have an audience question before we wrap up that we take every episode. And actually, it fits in very well with what you're talking about. So here's our audience question from Jerry. So Jerry asks to you, Julia, how can I better focus and find myself in the presence of God during the examen? What would you say to Jerry?
I would say, in my experience, even though prayer is like a spiritual practice, don't forget about you being a physical and an emotional person at the same time too. So what I do is I ensure that the physical space I'm in is comfortable, that I sit comfortably, that, all flies are exterminated from my room, that my ringer is off. And I try to calm myself emotionally too, so that I'm not coming into this prayer space being like, oh, I'm so mad at my grandma. She made me, do this and that again. Those are my tips.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. First, I want to thank you for something I think I've thanked you for before. Thank you for being such a good friend at the Synod. I always loved seeing you. You always made me smile, even when we were both struggling with different things. You were always such a good friend. And, I would say this, such a great asset in the Synod, and not simply because you were young and not simply because you're a young woman, but just because of who you are. And you were such an asset, and everyone knew it. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your spiritual life on our podcast today. And best of luck in your future studies.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Well, I'm so glad you got a chance to meet Julia. Isn't she remarkable?
Yeah, she was incredibly open-hearted, honest, courageous. I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like as a 22-year-old attending the Synod on Synodality, surrounded by all of these church leaders and bishops, and dealing with some contentious topics in the church.
Well, and really extraordinary because she and Wyatt were by far the youngest. So there weren't counterparts in other groups, right? There weren't counterparts from, Africa or Latin America. It was the two of them. It was Wyatt and Julia. And she really held her own. And she was very well respected in the Synod Hall. And I agree. I was happy that she was able to speak, candidly about, her experiences in the Synod Hall and with the church.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people listening or watching are going to relate to her experience of feeling those places of tension and frustration with certain aspects of the institutional church, and yet persisting in faith and in community and in this synodal listening process. What did you make of that?
Well, it was very real. Both of us had a very positive experience of the Synod. I hope that came through in our discussion. So it was a really inspiring and moving and really historic thing that we were able to participate in. But, from time to time, there were these moments where you ran into people and sometimes they came up to you and you realized just how far apart you were in certain issues. Obviously, we all can stand up and say the creed. We all believe in the same basic things. But, on topics like LGBTQ issues or women's ordination or economic issues, all sorts of things, climate change, there were some significant differences. And I think what she modeled, and which I think a lot of the delegates modeled, was this listening and this accompaniment. And look, we were 350 delegates from all over the world, from vastly different cultures. And the fact that we're able to, in a sense, sit down and come to know each other and be able to talk to each other, I think is a real sign for the world. I mean, the church can be pretty divided. So I think that what she experienced was really what a lot of the delegates experienced from, all sides, right? Because people will look at me and say, I don't want to, sit next to Jim Martin. And so they were struggling too. So it's always been part of the church, right? I mean, Peter and Paul were, arguing with one another, and the disciples, even when they were with Jesus, were, jockeying for position and arguing. And so I think it's something that we all have to kind of accept about the church, that it's always been like this, that it will always be like this, but that doesn't make it any less holy or any less the body of Christ.
Now, dialing back a bit, for those Catholics who were not at the Synod, but who might be looking at your experience and wondering, how can I enact this or practice this in my own context? What have been some key learnings for you, Jim, in approaching a church that sometimes frustrates us, that lets us down, and in which we ourselves are imperfect?
Well, that's a great question. I think first of all is, knowing some church history, knowing the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. You don't have to be a scripture scholar, but to know that this has always been the case, right? I mean, all the way back to Peter and Paul, all the way back to the disciples, even when Jesus was with them. So to say this is it's divinely instituted by Christ, but it's also a human organization. So this is going to happen. I think the second thing is St. Ignatius's idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt, always trying to put the plus sign on things, see where they're coming from. And then the third thing is this idea of friendship, right? Again, I can't quote it enough. St. John Paul II, which Cardinal Radcliffe quoted, affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. So it is a value to be friends with people, obviously just a value in general in the Christian life, but it's also important for the church and for collegiality and for dialogue to happen. So I really am a complete convert to this notion that we have to become friends before we can really discuss the tough things.
And if I might just ask one more question
Sure.
here. Do you have any tips now that you've had this incredible experience of making friends around the world? How do you, Jim Martin, make friends?
That's a great question. I think basically it's by listening, by wanting to learn about the other person's life, and by being willing to, as Jim Keenan, the Jesuit moral theologian, says, enter into the chaos of another person's life, which I love. Mm-hmm. So part of it is to really stand with that person. But really it's about listening, right? Who are you? Yeah. What excites you? What gets you up in the morning?
Being curious.
Yeah, curious and also being open, especially if it's a person who thinks differently than you do. Why do you think that way? And rather than kind of cutting them out. But I think it's really all about listening and taking the person where they are and seeing them as a beloved child of God.
Yeah, it sounds like a real spiritual discipline, the practice of friendship.
It is. And it's nice to have friends like you to talk about it with and friends like Julia to explicate it.
It sure is.
So thanks so much to Julia for joining us on our podcast, for being so open and vulnerable in her conversation. Thanks to all of you who have tuned in. We're really grateful that you're joining us for these conversations.